Today we have a talk by Allen Pittman on the Green Man, and it's archetypal reference to Christmas presents. So I'm sure this is going to be interesting, and we'll all learn something about who is this Green Man. I've never heard of the Green Man, but this ought to be interesting. So with that, I'll give it over to Allen Pittman.
Okay, I need some help. Can I have a volunteer from the audience?
Sure,
I feel like a stage magician.
I'm here already.
Well, I was out shopping, you know. You know how I shop all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And I found this, and I'd never seen it before. Walk across there. I want you to look at this.
It's gorgeous.
Now, it's Celtic, and that tells you how old the design is. And apparently the eternal knot is between the man on the right and the Green Man on the left, who has the winding beard. So that probably goes back to past the Celts. So I wanted you to see this so you'd have a sense of antiquity. So Charles Dickens didn't invent the Green Man, but he mentioned him. So, good. So this gives you a feeling and a sense of time.
Well, what is it, a robe
age.
of some kind?
It's just a fabric.
Oh, okay, it was planned together. I
It's
didn't-
like a hanging, yeah. Better it than me.
All right.
And so the Green Man goes back a long, long way. And what I'd like to do is try to connect what we did with the Templar lecture. Who was here for the lecture on the Templars? Raise your hand. Okay. Now, the speculation on the Templars, and it's not entirely idle, although I'm doodling a bit with the letters with a scholar in Wales about it, is that after the Templars started, a stream of teaching entered their Christian vows that was not necessarily in opposition to it, but it offset their original vows. Do you remember that?
Mm-hmm. Is that the Turkish influence?
Mm-hmm. And some of it came from Spain, but it was probably Moorish influence that was in Spain and those areas. And these things got mixed in with the Templar intention. So if you have the idea of an intention being like a river, and this intention is flowing, okay? And if the intention's good and pure and strong, then have this idea of this tremendous force moving through history. Now what happens is it gets interrupted by boulders and rocks, and it gets subdivided, and there's sandbars. And people use the river for irrigation, so they'll siphon off a little of it and take it somewhere. So when you have the original Templar motive, if you see it as a moving force, just like a river, I want you to imagine it's moving, and what happens is someone borrows irrigation canals or aqueducts and siphons those into this Templar river. So what happened with researchers is they did research on the confessions of the Templars, and some of the confessions, quite a few were done before they were tortured, and they matched up. So someone had either agreed upon something, or they had indeed brought in some other sort of teaching into their vows. And some of the fortresses of the Templars and the places they regarded sacred have been researched, and they've found sacred objects. And one recurring symbol is Bast. Do you know who Bast is?
Cat goddess.
Yes, cat goddess of Egypt. Another recurring symbol is Baphomet. Anybody know who Baphomet is? Tell us who Baphomet is.
Me, I was just
No,
going
behind you. I see the guy in the cigarette.
It's almost the same as pine. It's the conglomerate entity composed of the features of all creatures.
Right. And they found evidence of these two. And and other creatures, beings. Sometimes sacred skulls figure in, and some of the skulls were supposed to be the skulls of virgin goddesses. So there's a feminine element. They've discovered a goddess element, a bast element, and a pan element, and others as well. And it'll never be figured out. It'll be a bit like who shot JFK. Okay, it's going to be that complex, and there's going to be that much subterfuge. Because you've got to remember, the Templars evolved into a conglomerate corporation with thousands and thousands of people, with banks all over the world, all the way across Europe and back. So by the time they took in all these influences, something happened, and they became extremely powerful. And they were described by Rudolf Steiner as a premature intention. He said it was too early for them. That's why it didn't quite work, and they were torn down effectively. Now, as far as the Green Man is concerned, he's connected to Baphomet, and he's connected to Pan. But green is like every other color. Do we have any artists in the audience?
Rosy.
Okay, now you know in color theory, there's always two versions of a color. And one is based on pigment, and the other is based on what? Light. So with the Green Man, what you're going to see is, as the Green Man pops up through history, and he's been popping up for probably between 6,000 and 10,000 years. So I want you to see how prevalent this figure is in human culture. You'll see that there's a pan version, which you can call the pigment version. That's the leafy green man you see in the architecture of old chapels and temples and churches. Have you ever seen that? He has a fluorated face, and sometimes he's hard to figure out, and branches and leaves coming out everywhere. Usually it's acanthus. That's the leaf coming out. Sometimes laurel. Okay. That's the leafy green man that's associated with paganism, right? He's connected to the harvest, and most cultures have him. The Tibetans have him. The Druids had him, only they switched him up into a wicker man, and they put the murderers in him, and they burn him alive. Okay. And then the Chinese had the Green Man in the form of someone named Fu Shi, who was the inventor of the theory of the octave and irrigation. His wife's name was Nuwa, and some say that was a transposition of Noah, because he occurs at the same time as Noah. Okay. So this is the Green Man of pigment. This is the Green Man of the wood. And this guy pops up through history a lot, and he's taking a bit of a beating now because of what? Tell me.
Time.
Because of time and because of ecology. Now I'm going to use old historical data here for esoteric reasons, and most of you have studied enough of various religions to know why I'm going to put the Christ event as the center. Okay? I know this is not politically correct, but I'm putting it at the center for a particular reason, because it relates directly to when the Green Man shifted. Okay, and he shifted in our consciousness. And we'll talk about why he shifted and how he shifted and all that. Okay, let's take this chunk, and let's take this chunk. Okay. And let's put the most recent version of the Green Man here. Anybody have any idea who that would be, what that would be? It's on a can of corn.
Jolly.
The jolly guy. Okay. And what year is this? Okay. Now, let's go back here, and I'm not going to establish rhythm schemes, but we could. Now, any idea who the earliest manifestation of the Green Man would be?
Jolly Green Giant.
Yeah, well, the giants go back. So there is a green giant connection, and we should probably honor that, because the evidence is in our favor. Tell me a story the green giant occurs in, anybody.
Oh, Jack and Beanstalk.
Okay. Where would you plant that? Put Jack and the Beanstalk.
1700.
How's this? We'll just call him Jack for short. Okay. All right. Any others? Anybody want to speculate on the green giant back here? Well, we mentioned Fu Shi, who was the inventor of Bagua and irrigation, the octagon, theory of the octagon. Now, he was the first legendary emperor of China. We're going back 3,000 to 5,000 years, and if you go to China, you can still find his tomb. Now, obviously, we don't have the paperwork for it. But I went to see Bill Porter, who spent a lot of time going up and down the Zhongnan mountain range in China. And he went to the tomb, and it's there. And it's a burial mound. Looks like something like Etowah Indian mounds. And they've cut an octagonal door in it. And people still make the pilgrimage to the tomb of Fu Shi, who is the earliest known figure in Chinese history. Now, he's interesting because he's always associated with the spring and the color green. So he is a green figure. Now, to his detriment, he's not fully human. He's half fish or half snake. So he's a mer person. Okay, not a mere person, a mer person. Okay, and so is his wife. So he represents something like Pan, something with two natures, part human and part what? Okay. All right, let's move up from him. Is there anybody else way back here? And this is, we'll call this 3,000 to 5,000 years. Does anyone know the Epic of Gilgamesh? Do you remember his best friend? He was wild. He was a wild man. Gilgamesh had a friend. His name was Enkidu. Okay. And he had to be tamed. So he's a pan figure. So that's Sumer. So we have China. I want you to see the universality of this. We have Sumer. Okay. We have giants. If you want to connect him into that, we can go to Genesis 5. There were giants in those days in the Old Testament. So there it is in the Hebrew culture. So back then there was a very popular figure of the green man. Where would you put the Greeks in here?
Closer to the
Closer to these
center.
there.
How about here?
Anywhere from
Let's put them here for convenience, and we'll just put Pan. We all know who Pan is, right? Now, Pan is interesting because it means all. So Christ is called the Pantocrator, summation of all power. Okay. So it's interesting that there's this universal quality. He is depicted as green, and basically what the Renaissance and medieval artists did is they painted him red and called him the devil. Because Pan is Baphomet, he has hooves. He's part goat or part horse. And these were also two-natured beings. And there was a figure in myth called Chiron. And there was one also named Asclepius. And these were the teachers. Now, the ancient Greeks venerated these particular beings, even though they weren't fully human, because for some reason they credit them with full knowledge of medicine and military tactics. And how they're connected is through the tip of the arrow in archery, where they used to poison it to go hunting. So the expert poisoners were working in conjunction with the herbalists and the doctors. Does that make sense? That's how the knowledge was shared. So it was a unified field of knowledge. And the Greeks had this through Chiron and Asclepius and that tradition. So there's our green man with the Greeks. I showed you the fabric for the Celts. Okay, and we touched on the Druids. And we didn't mention the Egyptians, did we? Does anyone have any idea who the green man among the Egyptians would be? And I'll tell you because the Gnostics have left it in their manuscripts. It's a figure named Ibis.
The heroine?
sometimes has the head of a bird. Okay. And now I'd like to touch a bit on the Gnostics, because they had a figure they called Phos, as in phosphorus. Okay. And those who were achieving illumination or aspiring to illumination, and I know it's not necessarily the same thing, were called Phos or Photes. And this is connected to the word phosphorus, and that is connected to something in the brain. And I'm pointing this out because I want you to know that mythical wisdom and more contemporary wisdom and so-called scientific wisdom, they're all wisdom and they all contain truths that overlap. And so the reason I'm pointing this out is there's a tendency in modern society to think the old has been debunked. Do you all know what I'm saying? And what I want you to know is that the older knowledge was constructed of a kind of intuition that allowed you to see into something without knowing how it worked. The older knowledge was built on a kind of intuition that allowed you to see into something without knowing how it worked. Okay. So it is a kind of wisdom, and all of these ancient cultures had it, and it was woven into their myths and into their poetry and song and art and sculpture. They may have not been fully aware of the scientific implications that they were giving to civilization when they wrote a tale or said a poem. But if we go back now with, quote, scientific knowledge, which is sometimes not scientific knowledge, it's pure materialism. Okay, because science pertains to a methodology. And it's part of the word conscience, conscience. But if we go back with science, we can analyze these stories and we can figure out things in chemistry and physics and mechanics and dynamics and philosophy using these old figures. So the things they came to through their intuition or their imagination, we can now flesh out structurally, scientifically, rationally. Does this make sense to you? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now this is part of Rudolf Steiner's evolution of consciousness, and Owen Barfield said the same thing. Basically, what the poetry that sweeps through history, think of all the poems, all the manuscripts, all the chants and the cantors and the hymns, all these things as they come through history, this rich, rich embroidery that we can still grab a thread to and pull and look at. The language changes in the way they describe the world, which shows they see the world differently. Does this make sense? And what happens with the language is it goes through a very slow metamorphosis. And it goes from, I was standing and the Spirit fell upon me and I knew, to, I stood apart from the object and I have this opinion although I may not exist. And we call that evolution. Now remember, it's only evolution in part, because what it does show is we've learned to stand apart from the object and not participate in any way with it, and to look at it coldly, and even to look at ourselves coldly as though we are soulless beings, and to treat everything as though it's only pieces of matter sitting in stasis. You understand? Okay. Now, the modern mind that does that is extremely starved for that stuff. And it can be addressed through children. Okay? These beings, people and beings, because I think there are many kinds, they would have thought this was bizarre. It might have been looked at as something diabolic. Can you see why? So the question is, what happened here? So what has happened is that humans have evolved in their perception in a way, but they've also devolved in a way. The richness of the past was let go so the objectivity of the present could be achieved. So now we struggle for meaning. We struggle to feel what we know. It's tough. I mean, you're full of synthetic light, synthetic food, polluted water, polluted air. It's like the conspiracy is against the green man. Tell me what color the uniforms of the army are now. They're not green. Not anymore. They're gray. They're gray. For urban warfare. Now, do we call Martians green men anymore? What do we call them? We call them the Greys. Something has happened. Something has really happened. And it's on a can of corn, and it's also back in a Chinese tomb, and it's also happening in just basic things. The way we see the world. The greenness is being extracted. Okay, does that make sense? They had the greenness, we lost it, we got the grayness. Well, Charles Dickens figured it out. Where was Charles Dickens?
1830s.
Yeah.
Give or take.
Let's put Dickens here, bless his heart. There was a man who knew humanity. Okay. There's a story called The Christmas Carol. Have you heard of it? Okay. Who's the spirit of Christmas? Who's the first spirit that visits?
Goes to Christmas past.
What does that spirit talk about?
Well, Marley.
Well, Marley, we'll consider Marley the introduction
It was a
bar.
spirit. It was a ghost.
Okay, goes to Christmas past.
But the guy from Christmas Past was a jolly kind of a green-looking guy.
No, that's the second spirit.
Was that the second spirit? Okay.
Yeah. But now you mention him, we'll go ahead and go to that. That's in stave 2.
The lights.
Stave 2, which means chapter 2. They didn't used to be chapters, they used to be staves. And if you want to see a lot of staves, look at the tarot deck and then go back and read these old stories and find out what staves and staffs and runes pertain to. So in stave 2, the spirit of Christmas present appears, who is surrounded by green foliage. What does he say? Dig around in your memory. Dig around deep behind your eyebrows and see what you come up with. He says, I'm going to take you and show you things as they are, but you can do something about it. Okay? Now the difference is one spirit's about what?
Past.
One spirit's about,
The present.
Future.
Future.
and one is about present.
Right now.
Yeah. So this present spirit says, let's go. Now, this spirit is a giant. He's surrounded by green foliage and the harvest, fruit of the harvest. Okay. And he's about the redemption of time. Because what he does is he says, this is the way it is, you can do something about it, but you've got to change internally, and if you do it, you're going to create an effect. You can change your environment. Now, it's equivalent to mercury in an alchemical equation. And I don't know if Dickens got this wholly, although it wouldn't surprise me at all. It's about changing time. It's deep. It's deep. Because what he's saying is, to reform your behavior is to create a wave this way and a wave this way. He says if you tweak this just so, you can make up for the past and you can change and transform the future. In fact, some of these ancient cultures cotton onto this, and in Hebrew there's no past or future tense, it's all in present. But you preface the story with the word before. So The Hopi Indians figured it out too, because their language is structured the same. There's only an ever-existing present moment, and in that moment you change all time backwards, forwards, laterally, you name it. Sidereal, vertical, I don't care how you want to say it. It's changed. Now that doctrine was carried, as far as I can tell, speculative granted, I've got stacks of footnotes, you can look at it if you ever want to a place called El Khidr, which was one of the schools of the prophets in Haifa. It was called the doctrine of emanation, and students who know the Kabbalah have probably heard of it. And what it meant was, when your state became radiant and your behavior reflected your state, you could change the past, present, and the future through being. Like when you touch water and the ripples go out. That's the image. So this idea, we mentioned Genesis. The green man who occurs in Genesis, his name is Elisha. He had a student whose name was, and we know that because of the transfer of what? The mantle. Okay, now I'll just show you how interesting this is. In the 1940s, there was a novel published called Green Mantle by John Buchan, who was the head of British intelligence. And in it, he describes a story that, as it turns out, was actually true, and the names were changed. And it was about the taking of a city in Central Asia by one of the intelligence operatives who unwittingly ended up with a green mantle and ended up being the prophet that they expected. Now, I'll say it again. Unwittingly ended up being what?
A prophet.
Okay, I want you to see this is the green man's trademark. Say unwitting.
Unwitting.
Say clueless. Say lose your head. Because the green man's about what? Doctrine of the heart. So there's only two primary doctrines for Homo sapiens. One is the doctrine of the
eye.
The other is doctrine of
The heart.
Now, in this culture, we're real big on this. Only we're trying to convert it to a television very quickly. All right? But this is about this. Okay? And this is connected to the training of Elijah and Elisha, who were sympathetic with the animal kingdom, who were both called hairy, rough men, who wore camel hair, wide leather belts, and lived out in the wilderness. But they were the head of a school of prophets. It was a school, and they called their students the sons of the prophets. And when you read in the Old Testament about them, they say the sons of the prophets say blah, blah, blah. And Elijah says thus and so. I want you to understand these men were professors who taught a whole group and then would go off in seclusion and work on things. One of the doctrines that they taught was this doctrine of emanation, and that was about the redemption of what? Time. And I want you to know this because that way you'll always have time. Because time is not based on what you think. It's based on what you are. And the tendency is to see things through the rose-colored glasses or the existential dilemma-colored glasses. Okay? But if you have a sense of who this green man is, and I'm looking at this platonically right now. We're going to put God up here. If you don't believe in God, if you're a Buddhist, we'll call it the creative power of phenomenon. And if you believe we're in an existential flux, we'll just call it the great flux. Okay? Now, God shines down like a light, and there's 7 colors, and it's Roy, G, Biv. Red, orange, yellow,
Green.
Roy, and who's in the center?
Green.
Blue, indigo,
Violet.
and the central color is,
Green.
okay. So he's shining down. And in this little piece of history we're looking at, we're not looking at Atlantis and the very distant. We're looking at this green bar that hits with the metamorphosis and transmutation of the human being and what happened with Christ. Okay? So this is about the redemption of all time. And it did not just happen historically. It now happens in your life every moment according to your ability to be radiant. Now, how do you charge that battery? What's the secret of inspiration? Caffeine is a good start. You know who used to drink a lot of caffeine was the Ethiopian Sufis, and they brought that into the West. Because they found they meditated deeper into the night with more sharpness if they drank a little. And they would meditate for days on end on this. Okay. And that brings up the Sufis. And Allah have mercy. Where do they start? We don't know where they start. These great wool gatherers keep showing up and getting in the way. And they're Muslims. And they're terrorists. And they're not terrorists. And they're Jewish. And they're Christian. And we don't know what they are. Some are Zoroastrian. They have incredible writings and poetry. And they have a designation for a human being who has not had a teacher who achieves radiance. And you know what they call them? They call them Uarsi. And the Uarsi are those who've been initiated by the Green Man. In other words, they've got the wisdom to recognize you can meet someone of superior capacity who has not what? Had a teacher, had an education. Now, J.R.R. Tolkien figured it out. Because while the hobbits were taking their journey, they ran into this very strange man. And he was a human. And he talked in silly riddles. And he danced half the time. Now, he had a blue feather in his hat and yellow boots. Now, blue is the symbol of what? And yellow is the symbol of what? No, it's not. Earth. Nowadays. In its pigmented form. In its luminous form, it's the sun, but then it's gold. Okay. Now, if you combine yellow and blue, what do you get? And between that feather and those boots, there's this strange human being, and he looks like Adam before the fall. He's innocent, but he knows evil. And he wears the ring on his finger and throws it in the air, and it does nothing. He's not even tempted by the ring of power. And he always shows up at the right time, and then disappears again. And he can talk to trees and animals. He's a very interesting figure because he embodies all the qualities of who? The Green Man. But Tolkien never calls him the Green Man. In fact, there's a little passage where they say, "Who are you?" And he says, "I am in my name." And you see, that's what we aspire to. Is that. To be your name. So we're chipping away trying to get all the stuff off the label so we can see who we are. Well, this guy, he knows what his name is. And so there's no problem. He basically goes through life spontaneously helping, appearing, disappearing, and is ageless and has been on the earth since the beginning of time. Now, that is a literary figure that is not supposed to really exist. Guess what? There is a figure who's supposed to have been on the earth since the beginning of time, who has a human body, or can appear human, and he's called the Ever Verdant One. And the Sufis call him this. It's a name you should know. Khidr. Sometimes he's called Khidr, like kidding around. Sometimes he's called El Khidr. And if you'll remember, the temple, the school of Elisha was the temple at Al-Khidr.
Alan, isn't there a musical instrument called a Khidr?
Yeah.
Wouldn't be like the panpipe?
It might be very close. Now, in
I mean, it's a stringed instrument.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. In Turkey, does anyone remember his Turkish name? It's not Khidr, it's Khidr. Now I'll tell you why. He's cited in Turkey periodically. And he always appears as an old man in a white beard, but they say it's the Ever Verdant One. And buses don't go off cliffs because an old man comes out and stops it. And he says he needs a ride, and then he says, oh, I've got to go take care of my son, and the bus is halted long enough for the avalanche to stop. You've heard these kind of stories. Cultures have these stories. This old guy that shows up at the right time and lives are saved, guess who? He has a way of showing up. So this is a trademark. And remember, what did we say? Clueless, spontaneous. These are words that you describe this being. So he goes back. He's associated with these two men, but he's not those two men. Sometimes he's called a prophet, sometimes he's called an angel, which means a messenger, but he's not an angel. And the Islamic scholars are very careful with this idea. He's a being who mediates for human beings on this planet when he will. And he wanders around the globe. And he appears in a body. And in Turkish culture, he appears as an old man with a white beard. In other cultures, I don't know, he may appear in different ways. But I'm telling you that there's a tradition. Because when you realize that such a creature may exist on the planet, you suddenly become attentive. He's sort of like the old Irish Sinn Féin. Before they became terrorists, they were wandering policemen who slept under the stars. And they just went around doing good and reporting to the king everything's fine. This is the job of the green man. So there is the archetype of the green man, which we've looked at through history, and I want you to be familiar with that. And it's connected to Pan and the world of not light, but what? Pigment. Earth. You make paints from earth, right? That's the Pan green man. But the luminous green man, and if you want to know what color green, you watch the sun come through a leaf, a green leaf. Have you seen that color?
Mm-hmm. It's kind of sheer.
It's kind of sheer. It's like a phosphorus watch dial. Okay, that. Now, there's something that usually is only shared with initiates in some of the schools of Sufism, and that is that color can be seen in meditation. And when it's seen, it says that who's around. And it's often seen when you go to the tomb of a great teacher and meditate. Okay. And many people see this. It's known. Fortunately, the Turkish culture and the Sufis in that culture have preserved this idea of the luminous green man more than anyone else that I've found. And around the coast of Turkey, there's numerous little shrines to the green man. And if you go there, the Orthodox Muslims are very dubious about showing you these things because it indicates there's something else present. And each year there's a festival where they gather at a particular place on the coast and they go out in the water, in the ocean, and they wait for it to change from salt water to pure water. And it does it every year. Now, I don't know what the currents are, and I don't know the existential dilemma, materialistic, scientific explanation. But I do know it happens, and they do it every year. And they say that's because the green one is present. He turns the salt to the what? Fresh. Now we're actually going to get deep. The spirit of Christmas present is directly related to the Gnostic doctrine of what? It's that ripple in the pond. Tell me what it is. Emanation. And if you want to know what emanation is about, just hold up the idea of a lighthouse in your mind. And the other word for lighthouse is pharos, And the Egyptians used to call their kings what? Now you know what a king is supposed to be. Now, we're going to talk about the human body. Let's get some white on here. The eye, the brain. There's a major gland right there. If you look, if the sun comes through here, it'll hit that eye and it'll go where?
Ideal.
Mm-hmm. And from there, it's scanned onto the back, and somehow you flip the picture over and see everything right side up. We don't know why. You're supposed to see everything upside down if you have normal eyes, but the doctors don't know why the image is turned. Some people say that's evidence of a soul, because you're obviously doing something that's not structural. Okay. While we're on evidence of a soul, the other is the loss of weight at death, which is inexplicable. It's minute but real. Okay. Now, when we get down in our modern days where we have to weigh the soul, we sort of got problems, right? Okay. But it's where people are at in their head, and we have to deal with that. So, the human body, you know the doctrine of macrocosm, microcosm, right? As above what?
So below.
Okay. Now, there's also one pertaining to the terrestrial world, which is our body is an exact small version of what? The Earth. Now, we have a saltwater ocean, and we have a saltwater what? Bloodstream. And that feeds everything. Now, when we look at sunlight, and it must be sunlight, it cannot be computer light. And it was Rudolf Steiner who said actually electricity is the opposite of light. Which makes you wonder just what electricity is, doesn't it? We'll not talk about that right now.
Thank you.
But we'll talk about light. And in its beauty, and if you've seen the full spectrum color, the purples and the oranges and the greens and these tremendous colors that come pouring in when the sun comes up over the horizon. So much so that Powys, the Welsh writer, wrote a book on how to grow old. He found an old woman who looked like she was 30 instead of 80, and he said, "What's the secret?" She said, "In the morning I look out my window and I watch the sun hit the bricks on the sill, and it turns the bricks into gold." And looking at that every day did something to her. She took it in, and it did something. So when you take this in, it hits this gland which has, lo and behold, phosphorus in it. And if you close your eyes after you watch the sunrise, you'll see a light in your head.
Show us where the pituitary is. I thought that was the pineal was farther
That's in the
up than the
back.
pituitary.
There's one lower and there's one upper. This is the one that receives. You got your two eyes. This is looking down at you, okay? The light comes in and it's carried through two nerves. They make an X in your brain. Is everybody following this? The light comes in here and it goes and it makes an X in your brain. You know that Marvel comic called the X-Men, about men who can mutate. Interesting idea, isn't it? Well, that gland is right at the middle of this. And then you get your picture and you do all this stuff in the back of your head that the Egyptians were really good at. Okay. But this is interesting because if you look at the sun every day, you create such a secretion with that gland that you change the bloodstream and you raise your balance of melatonin. And you can't be depressed. Really. And what we do in the modern days is we take our subjects and put them in a lab and flash a strobe light in their face at a very fast rate for 20 minutes and charge them $2,000 and then give them their lithium and say, take this when it wears off. Well, God or Zeus or whoever put that sun out there, and if you look at that every morning, you're going to change your bloodstream. And you'll get some sweetness in that saltiness.
Alaska, the sweet have the highest suicide rates.
So I want you to see there's a chemistry behind the green man because of phosphorus. I want you to see there's a physical, quantitative, scientific, physiological aspect. Grunt if you understand that. That's important because I'll have you all know that as a yoga teacher, I have students come to me who are medicated, and if it's for depression, I give them one assignment only. And the assignment is to watch the sun rise every day for 40 days. Most people cannot do it. And you don't have to see the sun, you just have to face the direction. But if you can do it, you'll create a change in yourself that I cannot explain to you. Maybe it's not my place. Okay. But it's connected to the doctrine of emanation. Because the sun is radiant. And it's one of the earliest models of universal love because it's absolute. Shines on saved and sinners. But for you to be able to do that, that's a big order. Because you see, you have all these other things in your head that are not like the sun. Am I correct? And, you know, Goethe said something interesting. He said, you'll know someone by the company they keep. So who do you need to hang around? Okay. That's my sermonette on the sun. And we won't go into what artificial light does, but it does something else, and apparently it's not helping very much. Okay. So, the human bloodstream, it's got phosphorus in it. Almost every food has phosphorus in it. You have phosphorus in you, you can't live without it, especially your skeleton. The skeleton is a symbol of death. And yet, it's made of phosphorus, which gives what? Life. The human bloodstream has something in it just like the ocean. What is it? Is there another bloodstream that doesn't? Well, I'll answer the question essentially. Yes, it's called the lymphatic system. There's also something called spinal fluid, right? These things have much less salt, sometimes none. So I want you to be aware that there's 2 Christmas trees in your body. This is what I do to my kids. There's a red one. Let's call this red. There's a red Christmas tree. This is all connected to the great mystery of the green man. There's a red Christmas tree and there's a green Christmas tree, and we call these the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And when they get confused, you get tense and headachy, and you get diarrhea and ulcers and cancers. When you look at the sun, you separate these two and they don't confuse one another. Okay. When you exercise, you separate these two and they don't confuse one another. When you hold your breath between breaths, and then you get that tremendous relaxation, like if you inhale now for 4 seconds, inhale for 4 seconds. Now hold it. Exhale slow. So as you release the CO2 buildup, these 2 nervous systems, they separate, and your thinking becomes very clear. And if you look at something while you're holding the breath and that CO2 is drenching your bloodstream, your body's being poisoned, and you'll never forget that moment. So if you want to remember your grocery list, you hold your breath and look at it. You'll remember it. Because you're poisoning yourself. But we're interested in what the greening power. So you separate these two nervous systems, and then you're fully alive and you're more apt to be working on the level of emanation or enlightenment. Now, there's something about this gland, I'll just say this. It is speculative, but you need to know, because I don't know which of you is going to be a saint first. And you laugh, but remember, you're always the last to find out. Okay. Now, this idea is, you look at the sun often enough, and your body begins to manufacture the light itself. At first, you have to look at the sun. You have to hold your watch up to the light and make it glow. Remember those? Yeah? You got to keep holding your eyes up. Well, time comes when you close your eyes, and guess what? It sure is bright inside. So they called those men the Illuminati. Those who bear the light from within. And it's not a symbol. This is so important for us to realize. This is something that happens inside your skull. And when you roll your eyes up here, you see a light. Now, it also happens that usually concurs with a kind of spiritual development and wisdom. You understand? You don't have to see that to have the wisdom. You don't have to have the wisdom to see that. It's a phenomenon that exists physically when a certain state is realized under natural conditions. Now, over here in the material dilemma with DNA and machinery, we might be able to produce it and do some kind of monstrosity that exists outside the normal ratios of nature. But within the harmony of the spheres, within the laws of nature, this theoretically can be achieved. And you're following the old Gnostic path of the Phos, or the Phoses, the green men, also known as Hermes. Okay. So how to do it?
You were about to tell us that when you look up at the sun, you close your eyes, what color do you see? Isn't it green? Isn't it kind of a light green?
Well, now that's another issue. But we'll touch on that. How are we doing for time? And I'll finish up.
We've got a little bit of time, not much.
Okay.
We'll wrap it up.
Well, here's a traditional teaching for you. Now, the green man is interesting because there's also green with envy, which indicates the green man has a shadow. Okay. So let's talk about this very briefly, because in this world, a lot of things have a shadow. All right. Now the question is it pigment or is it light? Now in the Gnostic scriptures they say, when God created light and light stood up, darkness saw it and became envious. And what that means is the green goes from luminous to what?
Pigment.
Pigment. So there is a version that can turn. Now, let's go back to the rivers. The Templars were taking this great devotion, Christian devotion, but good old St. Bernard, who helped him write the charter, brought in Mother Mary, which was not part of the Christian path. It was bringing in the old goddess, right? You understand? He was bringing in the goddess archetype. I mean, thank goodness he did. It would have really got twisted.
You're going to tell him, you say Mother Mary was not part of the Christian stream, but it was a pagan idea?
Well, his emphasis, at that time there was not emphasis on Mary at all in the church. It was St. Bernard who stood up and said, hey Pope, let's bring this mother idea in. St. Bernard also brought in the erotic He wrote a tremendous commentary on the Song of Solomon, so he was our Christian tantricist, actually. And you can get his commentaries, they're incredible. You can get them at the Trappist Monastery. Isn't that funny? Oh, what a convoluted world. So St. Bernard brought in this Mary, devotion to the Mother of Christ, trying to balance. He was bringing in this tremendous feminine devotion. But there's an interesting little thing that happened. You see, Bernard lived in a 6-foot cell and would be carried on a sedan chair for miles, and to show his discipline, he wouldn't let his back touch the back of the chair. And he would practice prayer. And they'd take him from cathedral to cathedral, and he'd say, cut those gargoyles off, this is bad, and there's too much paganism over here, let's get down to the Cistercian fundamentals here. And so Bernard was this incredibly disciplined man, and he was excessively cerebral. He was a little slender, red-headed guy, very thin. Typical cerebrotoniac in physical type, do you understand? Very intellectual. He probably would have played the violin if he'd been given one, okay? Now, these Templars who took up his mantle were these big, strong, heavy ex-warriors and generals with scars and probably horsehair thread holding some of their flesh together. They were a tough bunch, okay? There were also the royal houses who were trained as warriors, and they're taking the ideas from this incredibly intense, little, shrewd, highly intelligent, devoted man who lives in a 6-foot compartment and goes all over Europe supervising cathedral construction. Now you got to see there's going to be a juxtaposition of ideas with these rivers. Am I making sense to you? Yeah. Now, what happened was Bernard brought in the mother. And of course we know there's a green goddess as well. But I want to show you what happened when he did. Because you need to know that this comes from the root of this. And this comes from what? So as soon as he brought in the mother archetype into this incredibly spiritual stream, what else did he bring in?
The matter.
Pigment.
Oink, oink. Now, he brought this in, he could contain it. You understand, Bernard could contain the devotion to the mother without it becoming the devotion to matter. He could contain it. But could these men, could these other men who later become thousands of soldiers all over the world, could they contain his devotion? It's a question. And you all know that every organization, as it expands, what happens to the founder's ideals?
Delusion.
There's a story about the soup of the soup. The man's wife makes a wonderful soup. The neighbor comes. He says, this is great soup. I'm going to send my best friend tomorrow to have some of your soup. She says, send him. He knocks on the door. Oh, I already gave most of it to my son. I'll tell you what, I'll add some water to it. And of course, the third week, the second cousin shows up for the soup, and guess what he gets?
Water.
Okay. Matter came in. Now, matter is earth, and earth is good. I don't think the earth is evil. Earth is good. We're here. Make the best of it, right? The blood of the earth is what? What's the most precious thing in the earth?
Water.
What's the most precious thing in the earth for greedy men?
Gold.
Guess which one the Templars got involved with?
Gold.
Gold.
Okay. And later, this gold, by the Chinese, who of course originated with the great serpent king, this gold was converted into notes.
And What color are the notes?
Greenbacks.
There are green notes in our culture. Other cultures are different colors, but it's interesting we do have green money. And there is a psychological play going
Wait a
on.
minute, when will it be gray money? Oh, I have a platinum.
There's something called a euro. We'll have to see what colors.
You know, they're changing the color records.
What's it
I forget
changing
what
to?
the date is. I think it's going to remain mostly green. They're going to start with changing part of it, like the faces or something. But I forget the dates, if it was 2003 or 2005.
It's gray on one side, green on the other.
Mm-hmm.
It might be more gray soon.
Mm-hmm.
Where does oil fit into this picture?
Oil is black gold. Oil is part of the gold equation. Actually, oil might even be closer to human blood because it moves, it circulates.
It came from living things.
Yes, exactly. It's carbon. It's got phosphorus in it. So there's some interesting things, and of course you see the state of water in the world. And before I forget, I should tell you that in the Arab and in the Middle Eastern tradition, Khidr is always depicted as a man being transported on the back of a fish across the water. And he's always associated with fish. So we're dealing with someone who is, we're all going to be police detectives. We want to get a profile on this guy, okay? The profile is this. He's not angel, not human. Can appear as a human, wanders the earth. Not apt to explain himself. He met Moses in the Quran. And Moses said, I sense you're one of God's. And he said, well, yeah. And he said, I want to study with you. He said, you can as long as you don't ask questions. Remember what I said about headless? It's indicating what is working.
Without needing to know.
Yeah, without needing to know. It's about the doctrine of emanation, of just being simply faithful and waiting what will happen. So Khidr walks with Moses and he kills a child, he rebuilds a wall, they're pursued by bandits, he rams a hole in a barge and the barge sinks and he gets frustrated. Now remember, according to the scripture, Moses was trained by the Egyptians for 40 years and he was brilliant. And a lot of the old scholars said he was the most brilliant man that ever lived. And in some of the Arab scriptures, Moses is bragging about his wisdom and says, who can rival me? And someone says, Khidr can rival him. And so he's made to meet him where two rivers come together. And in this place where two rivers come together, he meets him. And he goes with Moses, and Moses cannot contain himself. He has to ask, why are you doing this? Why does this happen? This is terrible. And what happens is Khidr says, okay, I can explain this to you, but remember, once I explain it, I cannot walk with you anymore.
Two rivers, sympathetic and...
Parasympathetic.
Parasympathetic and sympathetic, those are the two rivers.
Yeah. Salt and sweet.
He meets him right at that junction.
Meets him right at the junction.
I get it.
Now, remember, this is a path of devotion with Khidr. So the minute it's explained what happens to the path, it becomes the path of mind. So this is important for you to realize. Okay, the path of the Grail is the path of the heart. Because in tradition, the Grail was made of emerald. And the red blood went in the emerald Grail. Okay. So have that image in your mind. That's the poetic image. You'll run into it over and over. Anytime there's a green cup, a green bowl, if you're in China, it'll be jade. Each culture will have its version. It'll be a kind of turquoise in Peru in South America with the leopard mysteries and all that. You'll see it over and over, this green mystery, this containment thing. So it's the way of the heart. He explains to Moses. Moses gets the aha. Well, now I understand. And basically the point is that the green man has been through the whole area before and knows it through past experience. So he knows a lot of things about the whole situation in context that Moses doesn't know. But he has to behave spontaneously and quickly to get everything done. Does this make sense to you? Okay. So this is how he works. And before we forget, I wanted to touch on King Arthur because there's someone in King Arthur who will connect into this, and your Joseph Campbell soup will be complete. Okay. And there's someone called the Green Knight. Do you remember this? Has anyone ever read this?
Gawain and the Green Knight.
Gawain, who's the Knight of Purity, is challenged by the Green Knight, but also the Green Knight's lady. This is very pertinent because what happens is she tries to seduce him and she fails and she gives him her garter. What color is the garter? So he puts it on his arm. So in the story, we won't go into the details, but basically Gawain had the honor of taking the Green Knight's head, didn't know he was magical. And the Green Knight put his head under his arm, which is sometimes something we need to do. Because see, when you put it under this arm, it's near your heart. Okay. And the Hebrews, you know, they had the phylactery with the leather straps, and they had a box here with the Ten Commandments written, and they'd press it against their heart and feel it beat when they prayed. It was physical. It was as close as their own heart. Okay. And the Sufis say Allah is as close as your own heart. But if you want to see Him, you got to go in. You got to really go in. Okay. So he put the head under his arm, rode off. But it was a promise, so the Green Knight comes back to Gawain and says, now it's my turn to take your head, because it's the next spring when we all lose our head. Right? And Gawain says, okay, and he goes over, he puts his head down, and the knight says, where'd you get that garter? And he said, well, I met your one and only, and she gave it to me as a token of her honor. And he said, oh, I can't take your head then. Now that garter was transferred in myth to reality when Edward II founded the Order of the Garter in England, which was one of the first chivalrous orders. Now that order later formed the backbone of British intelligence across all of Western Europe. Okay? And that network was what brought intelligence in against the Nazis in World War II. Funny how things get around, isn't it? So sometimes if the intention is pure enough, I just want you to have this idea, if the river is guided, if the intention is pure enough, the implications are very far-reaching, but they're what? Unexpected. Totally unexpected from another area. The connections are so vast you would never find them, except in retrospect. Does this make sense to you? This is what the Green Man is about. That's the doctrine of emanation. It's a little like homeopathics. Very close to the homeopathic cure. Okay. How's that? Does that make sense? Any questions?
No, we'll do that in just a second.
Okay.
We'll bring you back up.
All right.
Well, that was a whole lot more than I expected. That was super. We had no idea that the Green Man had such a deep and wide-ranging meaning.
Matt Blavatsky talked about the Virgin Mary referring to virgin matter. Christ being born of the Virgin Mary is born of virgin matter, untainted or unsullied by
Exactly.
manifest experience.
And that brings up a similar doctrine of light that they have amongst the Greeks and the Russians. They have something called uncreated light.
Right.
And that means the thing before the thing. It's getting back to something very primordial. Again, If you want to look at the figure of Tom Bombadil in Lord of the Rings, you're going to see something very peculiar if you read what it was like to talk to him and how he behaved. Man before the fall, matter before it was tainted, light before it began its dance with darkness. Okay. These things are very old, and it's very significant because you see in this culture, we've come such a far, far way into the world of material that we have no sense of spiritual purity anymore. Because to us it's just stuff moving around anyway. But when you look at these old doctrines where they talked about the Vestal Virgins or the uncreated light, they were after a kind of concentration and a purity of intention, because that's what it takes if you're going to change history. And you'll even see it in Elizabeth I in England, the Virgin Queen, who established an empire and had this incredible power, and everyone was taken with her. But it had to do with purity of intention. In other words, the medieval concept of chastity was not just about sex, it was about everything. You understand, it was about your thoughts. You make your thoughts like a laser, and it gets so pure and so refined that nothing can stand it. And this is not emphasized much anymore. This idea of purity, it used to be taught to children. You wanted to stay pure. And now they make fun of it and they consider it naive. They don't understand that the doctrine was about concentration. If I have two loudspeakers and the sound quality is not good, I say that the fidelity is not very good. And you see, we get back to what did they mean? What did they originally mean? They knew what they were talking about. Yeah. What's the next question?
Well, last weekend we were visiting in Asheville, North Carolina, and I had never heard of the Green Man. But speaking of synchronicity, we were eating in this restaurant called Jack of the Wood, and they had this in there. You can show that to them.
Enjoy our handcrafted old world Green Man ales. Love Jack, take him home with you. Green Man growlers, Green Man party keg. There you go.
You can keep it.
Oh, great. Thirsty. Yeah.
I was wondering about chlorophyll using light to create sugar for energy.
Yes. That's the motor of the Green Man. Now, it brings up another issue that's very significant in, as far as esoterics, and that is this. The little we know about someone who becomes fully enlightened is there's a transformation of the tissue of the body. And what happens, obviously, is the blood disappears and is replaced by something. Because what Christ said was, or what they said of him was he had a body, had flesh and bone. Do you ever heard of fiber optics? We're just starting to get an understanding of how light can be moved, and we use it to carry telephone messages, to carry currents and waves. I have a suspicion that the blood vessels are changed into fiber optic cables, and chlorophyll might be part of the fuel mechanism for the glorified body on the earth in its pigmented form. There's a light body that vibrates beyond this dimension. But there is also, and this many people are not clear about, there is a shift in this, in which you live. And it's very deep. And I think chlorophyll has one of the secrets. The Persians gave us a big hint. They said, as the tree is to the plant kingdom, so the human is to the animal kingdom. Now, if you really got to run with that, you probably would find something. We have this capacity. There are people who eat very little. There are people who never eat meat. There are people who live off fruit. I've heard there are people who live on air. I've never seen one. But I do know as you get older, you eat less. And it's possible to eat less, stay sharp, and stay very virile, too. You see this in certain cultures, like in the Caucasoid Mountains. So there's some sort of shift in the human body, and it is possible to be healthy, strong. And again, one day of sunshine is equal to 1 caloric meal in the human body. So if you're out all day, you actually eat less.
That's true.
And that's just sun. Water itself can be a meal if it's charged in front of the sun. And the Indians all taught that. The water's held up in front of the sunrise and you pray over it, and it's impregnated with your highest intentions. And if that water is charged repeatedly, it builds up an exponential charge, and you can baptize people with it and heal them. Simple things like light and water we've gotten so far from, and yet it's extremely profound. And our technology is starting to catch up. In Europe, they're experimenting with water now. Just turning it and figuring out they can change molecular arrangements through moving water. And they're doing it with machines.
If I may divulge something to you, when I was in India, there was an old Brahmin who told me or asked me to perform certain things with water and rice to the effect that I wanted. That much I'll tell you.
Yes.
He was an old Brahmin priest.
The older cultures, they understood matter, and they respected the mother. And Omer Mikhail Ivanov, the Bulgarian mystic, makes certain references to water and to the sexual powers of human beings. And he says we don't understand the power we have within us, and we don't know how to use it. We're seduced by it. It runs our life, but we don't know how to use it. I remember one teacher saying to me, Alan, we may not know what the cerebral cortex is for because apparently we're not using it correctly. And you could say that about water and even rice. The green man's affiliated with grain.
And the Gnostics used an ale. But the Gnostics used wheat mash and water to purify the body.
Yes. And I mean, granted, you know, we have a nation of alcoholics, but remember that what started alcohol was medicine. And there's not a liqueur in Europe that wasn't originally designed as a medicine. And it was administered as such. These things were not always recreational. It used to be targeted with very great earnestness.
Like the current drugs that are abused now.
Right? Alcohol used to be a tincture to preserve something so it wouldn't get a culture. Now the Arabs, they would use sugar or honey. The Europeans use alcohol. The problem with alcohol is it's very drying, very hard on the liver. But we tend to have the genetics to absorb it. But the honey and those other ways of preserving are actually much easier on the liver than the alcohol. Yeah. But there had to be some way to preserve. Yeah.
Sir James Jeans said that matter was bottled up light. So that could be light with its radiance turned inward, and when we go inward, then we can cause the radiance to turn outward, and we can.
That makes sense. The Apostle Paul said that all things were made of light. Yeah.
Quick two-part question. One, perhaps this doesn't make much sense, but where does intention arise? Is it something of the mind or something of the heart?
I wouldn't separate mind from heart in the way you're speaking. But I will tell you this, that the physical organs are very different. And that there is something in the heart organ. And there is brain tissue in the heart organ. There is brain tissue in the heart organ.
Wow.
And there is brain tissue in the intestines.
Wow. Interesting.
And you can think with your gut. and you can think with your heart. So I want you to know that there's a very physical difference in thinking up here and thinking here, and you can think with it. It's not imaginary. Is that clear to everybody?
Wow.
The old Persians used to do this. Imagine love until you feel it fill your heart. Open it. Look inside through the red steam at the Ark of the Covenant, through a pentangle to an eye that's the eye of God. It's the eye of love. And then they chant Alim until their chest would vibrate a certain way. Okay. And then they would say, now take that energy and reach out to everybody with gratitude and extend your blessing. And then close the curtain and fill your heart with peace. And they meant your heart. How do you like that?
That's good.
It's a fantastic meditation. Fantastic. You can do it better than TV sometimes. Any other questions?
This is a comment actually on this thing of the head and the heart. The quotation of Allah is as close as your own heart. I've often heard this, Allah is as close as the pulse in the vein in your own neck, and that's the vein between the head and the heart.
And that brings up a lot of things about the head and the heart. And in the schools of the prophets, it was said that they studied of the 5 topics of the prophets, there was one completely devoted to the mysteries of the head and the heart. And then there was a whole study to the doctrine of light. And then there was a whole study to the doctrine of emanation, or how light radiates and moves. I've forgotten the other 2. There were only 5 subjects. You can make up the other 2 if you want. Yeah. Any other questions? That's it. We're ready to get something.